Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the 50th Chief Justice of India, Dr. Justice D.Y. Chandrachud. And on a personal request, could you check with him the mantra of his fitness too, sir?
नमस्कार श्रीमती सुमित्रा धुलिया, my very distinguished brother Justice Sudhanshu Dhuliya, Justice Manoj Tiwari, the Acting Chief Justice of the Uttarakhand High Court, Justice U.C. Dhyani, former judge of the Uttarakhand High Court, other judges of the High Court, distinguished members of the audience, including Member of Parliament Shri Pokhriyal ji, members of the bar, law students, participants, members of the Dhuliya family, including Mr. Himanshu Dhuliya, Mr. Tigmanshu Dhuliya, and everyone present here. आज मेरा संबोधन अंग्रेजी में होगा और उसके पहले मैं एक दो तीन शब्द आपको मेरी मराठी मिश्रित हिंदी में पेश करना चाहता हूं। खास तौर पर एक संदेश में आज के जो नवयुवक यहाँ पर हैं, अधिवक्ता हैं, उनके लिए खास तौर पे मैं कुछ कहना चाहता हूं। अक्सर हमारा ये अनुभव है कि भाषा के अनुभव के अभाव से आज के नवयुवकों की प्रगति में काफ़ी बाधा आती है। सर्वोच्च न्यायालय के सारे निर्णय जो हैं सारे हिंदी में हैं, सारे अंग्रेजी में हैं। 1950 से करीब 36,000 निर्णय सर्वोच्च न्यायालय के अंग्रेजी में हैं। पर डिस्ट्रिक्ट जुडिशरी में, जिला न्यायालयों में जो आर्गुमेंट्स होती हैं वो अंग्रेजी में नहीं होती है। जो नागरिक हमारी कोर्ट कचहरी में आते हैं, न्यायपालिका में आते हैं, वो अंग्रेजी नहीं जानते हैं। तो मुझे अक्सर ये लग रहा था, अब मुझे जज बनकर करीब 23 साल हो गए, 24 साल होने जा रहे हैं, कि भाषा के अभाव से और भाषा न जानने से हमारे नागरिक न्यायपालिका से काफ़ी दूर रहते हैं। ना ही उनको पता चलता है कि क्या चल रहा है वहाँ पर, और वैसे भी विधि की भाषा काफ़ी कठिन होती है। रेस जुडिकेटा, बड़े बड़े लैटिन फ्रेजेस का हम उपयोग करते हैं। तो इसलिए पिछले साल जब मैंने चीफ जस्टिस ऑफ इंडिया का जो ऑफिस धारण किया, तो मैंने सोचा कि क्यों हम इन 36,000 निर्णयों को सरल भाषा में, जो संविधान में 8वें शेड्यूल में भाषाएं हैं, उनका अनुवाद क्यों ना करें, और मशीन लर्निंग और आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस के तहत ये सारे 36,000 निर्णय जो है सर्वोच्च न्यायालय के, वो आज करीब करीब इसके 20,000 निर्णय हिंदी में इनका अनुवाद हो गया है। आईआईटी मद्रास के साथ हमने और भारत सरकार के कोऑपरेशन से भाषिणी सॉफ्टवेयर के तहत हमने इन निर्णयों का अनुवाद किया है। हालांकि करीब करीब 30,000 निर्णयों का अनुवाद हो चुका है, पर 20,000 निर्णयों का अनुवाद हमने वेरीफाई करके अपलोड भी किया है, ESCR। दूसरी बात ये थी कि निर्णय तो हम लिखते हैं, जजेस लिखते हैं, पर निर्णयों को कौन पहुंचाता है सामान्य नागरिक के लिए? प्राइवेट पब्लिशर्स पहुंचाते थे। अब हर एक के पास इतनी आमदनी नहीं होती है, रिसोर्सेज नहीं होते हैं कि समाज तक पहुंचाएं। तो हमने ESCR, ई सुप्रीम कोर्ट्स के तहत सारे ये निर्णय निःशुल्क नागरिकों के सामने हमने प्रकट किए हैं। तो मैं खासतौर पर अधिवक्ताओं को ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि इसका आप ज़रूर उपयोग करिए। जिला न्यायालयों में सुप्रीम कोर्ट के ये सारे निर्णय हैं, आप तक पहुँचे, यही हमारी कोशिश रही है। नागरिकों को न्याय पहुँचने से यही हमारी एक आशा है कि जो निर्णय हम देते हैं, और मैं सोचता हूँ कि इसके अलावा सारे जो उच्च न्यायालय हैं, चाहे वो उत्तराखंड में हो, दिल्ली उच्च न्यायालय हो, मुंबई उच्च न्यायालय हो, कलकत्ता उच्च न्यायालय हो, केरल में हो, तमिलनाडु में हो, हर एक न्यायालय और हर एक राज्य में अपनी भाषा में हम अपने नागरिकों तक न्याय पहुंच पाएं। और आज टेक्नोलॉजी की वजह से बहुत कुछ ऐसे साधन हैं जिससे कि हम बहुत सरल तरीके से अपने निर्णयों को, अपने विचारों को अपने नागरिकों तक पहुंच पाएं। तो मैं आपसे सब, स्पेशली जो यंग लॉयर्स हैं, आपसे मैं विनती करता हूं कि आप इसका उपयोग करें और सच में न्यायपालिका हर घर तक पहुंच जाए। यही तो हमारी इच्छा है और यही हमारा लक्ष्य है। I want to also, before I begin with the formal presentation this morning, the country has been riveted over the last fortnight or little more around the lives and the rescue of 41 workers who were confined to a small space in a tunnel which was threatening to collapse over their lives. I would like to actually begin my presentation by complimenting, first and foremost, the role of everyone who was involved and engaged in the rescue of our own citizens. The engineers, the administration, the laborers who use their skills on the ground to reach out to their colleagues. I also want to begin by conveying my sense of appreciation and high respect for each of those who were trapped in the tunnel, for the endurance which they showed over that period of confinement. Above all, I think this incident shows us that in times of crisis, our country stood together as one. Those of us like myself who have very little knowledge of what it takes to rescue 41 workers who are trapped in a tunnel, we lived only on one thing. We lived on hope and prayer. And I'm sure that I express the views of countless other citizens, countrymen, women, who lived on hope and prayer that these laborers would be rescued. So I feel that in that sense, my coming here is not just a tribute to a very distinguished judge who also happened to be the father of a very dear friend of mine, Justice Dhuliya, but also a tribute to the resilience of our own nation in conducting a rescue operation which has caught the attention not only of India but the world. And it's just a reminder as to how our country, of which we must be so proud as citizens, is once again leading the global world from the front. We led from the front in times of distress in COVID, when we ensured that our vaccines reached out to the rest of the world. And now in a time of adversity, we have shown that even in a country of 1.4 billion people, even an individual life is so valuable that we'll put together the resources of the entire nation, whether it is in bringing that machine from overseas to ensure that we carried out the rescue operation, or when the machine broke down, that we'll use our own internal resources to protect the life of every citizen. No citizen can be or should be sacrificed in the name of development and progress. And that is what the Uttarakhand incident has taught us. So my very high respect to everyone who was involved in the rescue, and above all, to these workmen who are there to ensure that the path of development reaches every corner of Uttarakhand. I congratulate everyone who has participated in the essay and debate competition organized in memory of late Justice Keshav Chandra Dhuliya. Competitions put human talents, intelligence, and discipline to test. While a competition is driven by many factors, it is not the last say on any person's abilities. I'm sure that you have had an enriching experience regardless of the outcome, and will look back fondly at your time over the last week. Debates, by their very nature, are designed for one person to be bested, and by the other, by use of arguments and analysis. This may divide two perspectives on a variety of issues, but the ability to accept the outcome after performing your best is the true reward of a debate. When I received an invitation from Brother Sudhanshu for speaking here, my law clerks and I had a divide of their own about who is the cooler one of the Dhuliya brothers. While there is no dearth of accomplished members in the Dhuliya family, two of my law clerks had an interview with my brother Justice Sudhanshu Dhuliya and remain admirers of Brother Sudhanshu's work on the judicial side. The others are more fond of Mr. Tigmanshu Dhuliya and his performance as Ramadhar Singh in Gangs of Wasepur. But as a 64-year-old Chief Justice of India, I have my own take. I think it is safe to say that the clear winners here are Justice K.C. Dhuliya and Professor Sumitra Dhuliya. For being successful parents. It's a very difficult thing when you belong to a family of freedom fighters, as Pandit Dhuliya was. It's a very difficult legacy to carry forth. When you belong to a family which has devoted so much to the cause of the nation. And even on my way here, Brother Sudhanshu was telling me of Karma Bhumi, which was published in Lansdowne. It is very difficult for succeeding generations to fill in those shoes. People in the outside world believe that if you belong to a distinguished family, as Brother Sudhanshu and his brothers belong, it's all easy for you. A door opens, it may be true, but living up to what has been laid down by the previous generations in the family is no easy task at all. And in that sense, I really would wish to compliment the succeeding generations of the Sudhanshu, of the Dhuliya family, Sudhanshu, Himanshu, Tigmanshu, for having carried on and accepted the baton for serving society. Somebody in the Indian Armed Forces, somebody in the judiciary, somebody in the world of art and visual media. All these are essentially facets of public service. And I want to begin my lecture this morning by emphasizing the need for public service. Because the true worth of a nation does not lie merely in making material progress, which our nation is of course making. Less and less people now are in the poverty line segment of our society. That's the progress of the nation, which we must aspire for. But individually, we must look beyond that. Because it is only when we as individuals develop the idea of service to society, service to humanity, that we take our own lives to a different plane. And service to humanity does not necessarily mean service by being employed in the government. Not at all. That's one avenue for service to society. You can serve society whether you're doctors, whether you're engineers, as they were in the rescue of these 41 laborers, whether you're chartered accountants. But in service to society, you will realize that you uplift your own evolution as individuals. And in that upliftment of your own position as individuals from the realm of the mundane to the realm of the sublime, that you really become leaders for tomorrow. And I see so many young people in the audience that I thought that without sounding patronizing, that I must begin this with a little word of not advice, but sharing my own lived experiences. As we are concluding an essay and debate competition, I thought it would be an opportune moment to talk about the relevance of debate and deliberation to our society and civic structure. Therefore, I will be speaking about democracy, debate, and dissent today. Since we are in the pristine state of Uttarakhand, which is also known as Devbhumi, I thought we must pay tribute to the currents which the holy book of our nation, the Constitution, has cultivated. First, I will talk about the objective of a democratic society and the role that the aspirations of citizens play in it. Second, I will talk how deliberation underlies our democratic foundations and why it must inform persistent engagement with the polity. Lastly, I will talk about the vitality of dissent and the direction of a democracy. The Constitution was adopted in an atmosphere of expectation and idealism. The framers of the Constitution rooted these expectations in the nation's ideals and provided the institutions and processes for achieving them. The Constitution was designed to break the shackles of traditional social hierarchies and to usher in a new era of freedom, equality, and justice. All this was to be achieved through a democratic spirit, using constitutional and democratic institutions. So many nations attained independence with us, but the hallmark of our nation is that by the spirit of dialogue, by the spirit of democracy, by the spirit of acceptance of the viewpoints of others, we have been able to keep the power of violence subdued by the power of the Constitution. Many other nations which attained independence with us have not been as fortunate as we are. But the power of our nation and in our achievements lies in the spirit which the Constitution has given us. The spirit of discussion, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of realizing the lived experiences of others and internalizing them into our own lived experiences. Our country has a robust democratic heritage which it has earned over the last 7 decades through constant dialogue, experimentation, and participation. But to truly appreciate this heritage, we must explore a primitive question about what purpose does democracy serve in our society. In Abraham Lincoln's famous words, democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. People therefore form the basis of democracy. This sentiment has been universally echoed. The first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his book The Discovery of India, highlighted his interactions with people at public meetings, where he would say that ultimately what counted were the people of India. And since then, through the last 7 decades, this is the common feature which has permeated the entire political establishment in India. Namely, what counts are the people of India. And though I belong to the judicial fraternity, it is important that we recognize the role which has been played by other institutions of our democratic polity, Parliament, the state legislatures, the executive, whether in the states or in the union, in fostering this unique culture in our polity that has become the hallmark of our nation. Mother India was essentially its millions of people, and victory to her meant victory to the people. But one could as easily ask who these people are and in what way does democracy serve them? At its most basic, democracy ensures that people get to vote in periodic elections, that every person has one vote and every vote has one value. It is a way of constituting political relations such that the exercising state power receives popular authorization. Democracy is messy and imperfect, but inherent in it are the postulates of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Mere appeal to voting and governance by those elected through periodic elections will remain an incomplete endeavor in the democratic experiment without upholding these postulates of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. These postulates are upheld in two ways. First, by robust institutions that carry out democratic functions, and second, by introducing procedural guarantees which prevent seepage of bias and unfairness in the process of decision making. Democracy requires constant dialogue between differing opinions and civil society organizations to fulfill the aspirations of the people. Imagine, for instance, an uninstructed cook without utensils. Imagine also a cook who is completely unsupervised and procures ingredients and utensils, but instead of using them, keeps them as personal gains. Both these scenarios would fail to achieve the end goals. But even if the chef were to have adequate tools and supervision, they would still fail to meet the expectations of the consumers if they receive no feedback or instructions. Democracy unleashes the aspirations to fundamentally reorder social relations in a completely new way. It is premised on the recognition that there is no natural source of authority that can exercise power over individuals. Therefore, people are presumptively, as it is said, free and equal. This presumptive equality in a democracy hardly reflects the reality of our society. Dr. Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar, on the eve of the enactment of our Constitution, had addressed the Constituent Assembly when he said, and I quote Dr. Ambedkar, "We are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril." Democracy is contingent on certain minimum guarantees where free citizens can genuinely claim control over the circumstances of our own lives. First, it must routinely produce consensus decisions or consensual decisions without arbitrary or unfair imposition of power. Second, citizens must participate in civil and political discourse and have an interest in it. This is a social world where their moral status of citizens is acknowledged, a world which is structured to enable their freedom and serve their interests. Third, citizens must associate with each other, not only as competitors, but in a relationship of reciprocal recognition and mutual respect. However, this consensus, discourse, and association can only happen where democracy acts towards the ends of uprooting social hierarchies and prejudices. For all citizens to feel free in a democracy, the state must side with a weaker population, which may be a numerical or social minority. This may at first appear to be at odds with the democratic principle of majority rule. However, a mere rule by majority can be established by many forms of government. The beauty of a democracy is the sense of moral status with which all citizens can participate in a country and the consensus in its decision making. In a democracy, the majority will have its way, but the minority will have its say. To be equal is not only to be equal in the eyes of the law, but also to be treated as equals by our fellow citizens. Laws are the most visible guarantors of and impediments to personal freedoms. However, the indignity of inequality often comes not in the form of a policy or a law, but in the form of, say, exclusion from informal workplace gatherings, or even social groups in school and university due to religion, caste, gender, or sexual orientation. One of the biggest challenges we collectively face is how we surmount issues of this nature where there is no violation of a legally enforceable right in the traditional sense. Members of social minorities who are unlikely to be represented through electoral democracy because of religion, caste, sex, or sexual orientation are overrepresented before the courts in constitutional cases. But certainly, judicial institutions were neither meant to tackle such problems, nor are they equipped to do so in all cases. The issue with framing all social and political issues in the language of rights and resorting to the courts to resolve these issues is that it reduces the constitutional space envisaged for other democratic institutions and mechanisms. The Constitution envisions other methods to which the abuse of power can legitimately be checked. This includes debates and discussions inside and outside the legislature on crucial issues. The executive can be held accountable for its actions by Parliament, inside the House and outside by the citizenry. While the Constitution grants rights to citizens and places a corresponding duty on the state to enforce such rights, the real test of the Constitution is seldom in courts, but in society. George Orwell's fable, Animal Farm, throws light upon the issue that I am attempting to elucidate. In the fable, the animals in Manor Farm rebel against their human owner. After a successful revolution overthrowing the humans, they adopt 7 commandments. One of the commandments is that all animals are equal. However, Napoleon, the pig, establishes an authoritarian regime. Napoleon demands that the hens hand over their eggs to be sold. When the hens deny, they are starved and later slaughtered. Similarly, though it was the idea of Snowball, another pig, to establish a windmill to ease the workload of the animals, Napoleon takes credit for the idea, thus distorting the truth. Orwell ends the fable with the message, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Why were the 7 commandments not sufficient to protect the rights of animals? The governance in Manor Farm fell apart because there were no entrenched rules or institutions for governance. The lack of such rules led to an arbitrary exercise of power, radically altering the very content of rights themselves. By its very nature, a democracy may be guided by the Constitution, but its force must be driven from the morality inherent in constitutionalism. The rights given by the Constitution are always at the risk of becoming a parchment guarantee if the Constitution does not establish a structure that effectively checks the exercise of power and abuse of it. It is therefore imperative for citizens to engage in a dialogue with each other and with the legislative and executive arms of the state. The practice of constitutional values and organic reorientation of societal practices is essential to achieving the constitutional vision. Active participation by the citizenry in the democratic process in ways that are not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, but are nonetheless implicit in the Constitution structure, is indispensable to realizing constitutional rights. Essential to this are structures that enable citizenry participation. An informed electorate is a choosing electorate. Without such information, a lot of what we say about the power in the vote of the people would just be meaningless. Would a citizen be a contributor to the democratic process or a passive observer depends on their access to relevant information and their ability to not only consume it but to engage with it. This engagement and debate lie at the core of what we call a participative democracy. A participative democracy simply entails a democracy that operates on and promotes deliberation. This deliberation emerges not only from the need to secure the right to speech and expression, but also publicly engage with the ideas and enable transformation. It is rooted in the very conception of democracy, and it liberates a democracy from its majoritarian impulses. While the right to free speech entails truth, discovery, and self-fulfillment of the citizen, its primary purpose is critical interaction and debate. There are overlaps, but in the context of a democracy, the relevance of free speech lies in deliberation with the uncomfortable aspects of our realities. If a democracy cannot safeguard discourse around the needs of all its people, it falls short of its promise. Thus, in order to resolve their discontent, a democracy must begin by hearing the voices of the people. For instance, India's official Oscar entry in 2018, Newton, told the story of a government clerk who is deployed in a remote insurgency-ridden village in Chhattisgarh on election duty. The story of his many maneuvers to have people exercise a simple right to vote is an uncomfortable truth as much as it is a creative exercise. What it also does is show that the heart of a democracy lies in people willing to participate and register their voices and the framework that it takes for people to exercise this will. While free speech is in and of itself a whole universe of discussion, I intend to speak of its discursive purpose in a democracy. As I said earlier, a democracy continues to be one when the electorate is informed and has both access to and influence over its governing bodies. A discursive democracy creates a fertile ground for deliberation which is inclusive and egalitarian. Its institutions must ensure that everyone can engage in a discourse on equal terms, and no force except that of better argument interrupts such an engagement. I will elucidate this by tracing how deliberation underlines our democracy from its very inception in the Constituent Assembly. The framers of the Constitution were tasked with stitching together the fragments of the country as they found it into a democracy. The Constitution has endured over the 7 decades and has been internalized both by the masses and by the elites. It has provided the basis for limitations on ambitious executives and provided a language of politics for various groups in society. However, there were several imperfections in the conditions in which the Constitution was enacted or adopted. First, there was the colonial legacy of poverty, illiteracy, and social division, which left many to be skeptical of the survival of India as a pluralistic society governed by a democratic constitution. The endurance of the constitution to this day is thus quite uncharacteristic in a society like ours, as someone would say. Second, the cause of this endurance can hardly be its perfect composition. The Constituent Assembly did include a diverse set of members, but it was predominantly a majoritarian, upper caste, male urban exercise. In a very recent book, Achut Chetan, a book about the founding mothers of the Constitution, writes that while they did play a formative role in envisioning a modern universe for the women of the country, their narratives as well as the history of their contributions were largely subsumed by the dominant, quote unquote, founding fathers narrative, a term we almost subconsciously adopted in our gendered vocabulary to represent the framers of the Constitution. So, if not its inclusive composition, what exactly explains the continued relevance of the Constitution to our lives? The answer lies in its discursive foundation, as well as discursive potential. Its composition aside, the process of its framing was an inclusive exercise based in discursive democracy. The Constitution, owing to this inclusive process, resonated with the people of the country and created windows of engagement with its discontents. This is precisely the reason for its entrenchment, the ability to promote debate and deliberation. Instances of debates from the Constituent Assembly demonstrate how deliberations that lead to decisions impact our lives just as much, if not more, than the outcomes. For instance, despite Mahatma Gandhiji's insistence, local self-governance was not made a part of the governing structures of the Constitution, but were relegated to the non-enforceable directive principles of state policy. This was the result of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's understanding of the Indian society as deeply fragmented along the lines of caste. Local self-governance in such a context would have only created a legal structure that was rooted in the social reality of inequality and discrimination. However, after the failure to meaningfully engage with our rural populations through many top-down efforts, the 73rd Amendment to the Constitution fell back on the principles that were earlier considered unfit and reintroduced through local self-governance. We can argue if this change was reflective of the altered social reality or merely responded to the administrative inconvenience, and also whether Dr. Ambedkar's fears were adequately addressed. But the point I make is simply that the outcome earlier discarded at the birth of the Constitution in one deliberative exercise was altered based on the debates that transpired earlier. That shows you the strength of our Constitution, the constant process of evolution, of change, of alteration, of debate, of adapting the Constitution to the new reality of a new India. That adaptation reflects, in that sense, the strength of our society and our nation. The Constitution, while firmly anchored in principles of social justice, responds to changing social realities. This is because we have a record of the debate that transpired in the process of its making. A legitimate debate which proceeds from the desire to learn and to expand the public discourse on a subject is relevant precisely for this reason. The process of reaching outcomes is far more important than the outcome itself. If you have read a very beautiful book by Paulo Coelho called The Alchemist, it tells you that the journey is as important as your destination. In the context of the Constitution, it is said that deliberative exercise such as these are bound to have relative winners and relative losers. And of course, there are relative winners in the nation and there are relative losers in the nation. But despite the loss, the relative losers, if we can call them that, know that these imperfect outcomes are not impervious to change. With social change, the framework of rights that a democracy guarantees will facilitate the change of these outcomes. What a certain group has lost in the present negotiation will be up for renegotiation, and the framework, such as the fundamental rights guaranteed in the Constitution, will facilitate the process of renegotiation. For instance, the Women's Charter of Rights and Duties, drafted by Hansa Mehta in 1946, one of the foremost voices in the Constituent Assembly, contained several progressive demands, such as the woman's right to limit the size of the family, recognition of women's work as homemakers, and demands for creches for working women, among other things. While these were not made a part of the constitutional rights regime right away, they were later made a part of the various legislations on maternity benefits and workplace regulation. The Constituent Assembly engaged even beyond the members of the Assembly itself. It was constantly flooded with postcards, representations, and memoranda from all nooks and corners and crannies of the country. The Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly would acknowledge the representations and in some cases even offer a detailed reply. Those who participated in the constitutional bargain had a stake in its successful implementation and also in its endurance. Unlike constitutions of authoritarian regimes, such as the 1889 Japanese Constitution, which was announced as a gift from the emperor to the people, democratic constitutions like ours endure due to the continued relevance. And therefore, never underestimate the power of those words in the Constitution, we the people. Beyond the Constitution, to engage meaningfully in a discourse that is governed only by the merits of the arguments, we need to strike a delicate balance between the diversity of opinion on the one hand and agreement to basic rules of engagement on the other. Deliberation thrives only in conditions that promote candid discussions amongst all, unmitigated by markers of status, caste, and identity. A democracy, in order to be more than a mere approximation of preferences of a group, must engage with all its stakeholders. This engagement may or may not lead to an outcome right away, but will definitely remain etched as a historical fact, capable of being resurrected in the future. But I want to emphasize the importance that we as citizens must have an agreement between ourselves on basic rules on engagement with each other. We must never, in the quest for democracy, forsake these basic rules of civilized behavior, basic rules of engagement which sustain the solidarity of a nation for the future and in the present. This inclusion and diversity separate a deliberated outcome from a heckler's veto and a genuine, even uncomfortable deliberation from an echo chamber. Deliberation is the difference between a majoritarian decision that is foisted on an unwilling electorate and a decision that the people are willing to accept, engage with, and hopefully alter one day. A deliberated outcome accords legitimacy to the institutions of governance. It is the difference between a defeated idea and a disenfranchised democratic participant. While a defeated idea may eventually erode with time, a disenfranchised democratic participant militates against the very foundations of a deliberative, engaging constitution. And that truly reflects the strength of our polity and the constitution. In a diverse democracy, it is quite likely that certain opinions are heftier for reasons other than their intrinsic merit. There will, of course, be outcomes that are favorable to some more than others. If we truly manage to incorporate all streams of ideas into our decision making processes, that by itself will not lead to outcomes that are acceptable to every participant in our society. The answer lies in what these outcomes represent. Deliberative democracy entails the ability of all individuals, subject to a collective decision, to engage in authentic deliberation about that decision. While deliberation sustains a democracy, dissent nourishes democracy. If democracy means that the views of one section of our society prevail, then it necessarily implies that a deliberating and eventually a dissenting minority. And this can at times be more powerful than an unthinking society ruled by a slogan. A servile and subservient population guarantees a weakened democracy. There is an Urdu couplet by Sarsal Sailan which says, चमन में इख्तिलाक ए रंग ओ बू से बात बनती है, हम ही हम हैं तो क्या हम हैं, तुम ही तुम हो तो क्या तुम हो. Which really means that the essence of a garden is formed by the mingling of diverse colors and fragrances. What good am I if it is only me? And what good is it if it's only you? Dissent emerges from profound questions about the working of the society. Abolition of slavery, annihilation of caste, emancipation of gender, women, and religious harmony were all once dissenting opinions in the globalized world. However, these dissents hold the power to fundamentally restructure our society by sparking an important conversation. These dissents emerge not from thin air, but from a democratic culture of fierce debate. That is how our society has moved from a society which excluded women in the armed forces to a situation today where I read in the newspaper that one of our lieutenant commanders is now going to command a naval warship. That is the process of deliberation, of change. There was a time when we thought that women couldn't be in the armed forces. How could they be at the border? Now you have women who are leading from the bunkers, they are leading from the warships, and they are flying all the fighter aircraft. That's the process of democratic deliberation, change, and what I mean by a discursive or a participatory democracy. And that's why I say that these dissents emerge not from thin air, but from a democratic culture of fierce debate. Therefore, a society which does not encourage its citizens to critically think, question the powers that be, and engage in non-conformist democratic discourse will fail to progress because it will fail to create a culture of dissent. While social harmony among citizens is a prerequisite to democracy, it cannot be manufactured by removing conditions under which dissent may be freely expressed. A society is often known by its great dissenters because dissenters inform us of the location and direction of a democracy. Dissenters like Justice John Marshall Harlan in the US Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Justice Harlan was the lone dissenter in the opinion which upheld the racist separate but equal doctrine in the United States and affirmed the Jim Crow laws. In our own country, Justice Khanna's lone dissent in ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkan Shukla warned against the perils of accepting executive excesses into the fundamental rights of citizens during the course of the emergency. Ultimately, these dissents, like all dissents, were not only speaking to the times in which they were written, they were speaking to the future. Dissent in a democracy, even those which are unpopular and unacceptable, give us windows to the future, and they are ultimately windows to our own soul. Plessy versus Ferguson was overruled by the American Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education. And ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkan Shukla was overturned in KS Puttaswamy versus Union of India. As we conclude this memorial event, I hope that the young minds that participated in this event continue to be committed to the values of the Constitution, which cultivate a culture of democracy, debate, and dissent. These are the sustaining pillars of our society, and my only hope for the future and my appeal to the young generation is please have a sense of the basic rules of engagement within the framework of the Constitution. A basic rule of engagement based on peace, on stability, on acceptance, while at the same time accepting the importance of a culture of debate, deliberation, and discursive democracy that is so truly the hallmark of our nation. Thank you. Namaskar.